And welcome to another episode of G220 Radio. This is Ricky Gantz, and I'm with Mike Miller. And again, as I said, we are G220 Radio, and we've got a special program for you tonight. We are excited. The title of this program is Being Born into Mormonism, and we have our guest, Sandra Tanner. This is episode number 364. As I said, Mike's with me. Mike, how you doing, brother?
I'm doing pretty good. I'm excited about this. I've had... in the military, I had a really good friend who was Mormon and got invited to meet the Mormon missionaries in England and was never invited again.
Wow. So as I said, we have Sandra Tanner. You can see her on the screen with us. Sandra Tanner is the great-great-granddaughter of Brigham Young. And so we're excited. We want to hear about some Mormon history, how she came out of Mormonism, and how we can effectively, and graciously, lovingly evangelize and witness to our Mormon neighbors. And so, Sandra, welcome to G220 Radio.
Okay. Glad I finally figured out how to get here.
Well, like I said, we're definitely blessed to have you tonight. We're really looking forward to this. As I said in my email that I sent to you, I was doing a Bible study here. We do a Bible study, a biweekly Bible study, and we came to Mormonism. And we took 2 weeks on Mormonism because as I started to listen to many of your interviews and stuff from Mormon Research Ministries and others, I was just fascinated by the history of Mormonism. I never really cared much about history when I was in school, but as a Christian, I care about Christian history. And then American history is also now something that I enjoy learning. And this is a part of American history, Mormonism. And so I was really fascinated by just going through and understanding how Mormonism came about and learning about Joseph Smith and understanding rightly that this is not biblical Christianity. This is many things that are contrast what we believe as Christians, but or conflict with what we believe as Christians, I should say. But it was just very fascinating because of this Mormon history. And so, and you have a line back to the second president of the Church of Latter-day Christ, Jesus Christ. The Church of Latter-day Saints, Jesus Christ. I think they changed the name, though.
Close.
Yeah, close.
Yes.
So why don't you tell us a little bit about Mormon history? Well, first tell us a little bit about yourself. I know many of the listeners may already be aware of you, are familiar with you, but for those that may not, why don't you share a little bit about yourself?
Well, I'm from a fifth-generation family, going back to Brigham Young, who joined Mormonism in 1832, approximately. My husband also was from a fifth-generation Mormon family. And when we met, we both were having questions about Mormonism. Gerald was further along in his questions than I was. And he started sharing with me that Brigham Young taught all sorts of odd doctrines the church doesn't teach today. And then he started telling me how Joseph Smith had edited and rewritten his Doctrine and Covenants, had changed his theology, and that launched me into study. We had a whirlwind romance and announced to our families that we're leaving the church, we're getting married, and we're not having a temple marriage, and we're going to have a Protestant minister marry us. So other than that, is there any problem? So we were starting our married life right off with controversy with everybody. We had a struggle on trying to figure out what was true and not true in Mormonism, which launched us into a very detailed historical study, which ended up being a lifetime effort of studying the history of Mormonism. But it was started out as our own search for what is true. We saw problems in regular Utah Mormonism, dropped out of that, but we still thought, well, maybe the Book of Mormon could be true, and maybe it's just everything after the Book of Mormon that's not true. So we tried that for a few years, went into a little splinter group of Mormonism that believed just the Bible and Book of Mormon. And then finally we met people that could talk to us about why the Book of Mormon itself couldn't be a historical record and why it couldn't be an equal to the Bible. Along the way, we both came to faith in Christ. after visiting different churches and talking to different people, it was, for me, it finally came together when I heard a Christian minister preaching on the radio from 1 John chapter 4. Herein is love, not that we loved him, but that he loved us and gave his son as a propitiation for our sins. And it was as this minister explained that section that I finally realized that the sin nature separated me from God, and that I couldn't earn my way to godhood. So listening to that radio station, I finally came to faith in Christ. Still struggled with the Book of Mormon, but Gerald and I did finally set it aside, went on with Christian research, and ended up having a ministry. We never started with that idea. That just evolved.
Yeah. I worked with a guy, and I was familiar with Mormons. I had Mormons that had come and knocked on the door. I've had conversations with them when I ran into them on the streets. But I was working with a guy that told me he was a Mormon, and I began to share some of my concerns about some of the teachings from Mormonism, and he said, no, I don't believe that. We just hold to the Book of Mormon. And I didn't know at the time that there was a separation, where there was the LDS church, but then there was these splinter groups of Mormonism. And so I really didn't know how to respond. I was like, I don't know what this is about. I only know about Mormonism and holding to the different authorities like the Book of Mormon, the Pearl of Great Price, and some of these other authorities that they hold to, the Doctrine and Covenants. And so I was kind of, that was my first interaction with someone who was from one of these splinter groups, you know. But as I was doing the study and then listening to your story as well, along with your husband as well, who was kind of very influential in that, obviously, because for those who may know your story, you went to I forget what you called it, but like a Bible study or something with your grandmother, and you saw this good-looking man that just caught your eye, and so you was fascinated to want to learn and study what he was teaching.
Yeah. Right. Yes, ministers that we met were thrilled that we had left the Mormon church, but like you were saying, they didn't know how to deal with someone that just believed the Book of Mormon and didn't believe plural gods or temple ritual, Melchizedek priesthood, or those things. And it was only when we finally met someone who had studied the Book of Mormon itself that they started pointing out to us, there's no maps for the Book of Mormon people, there's no artifacts, there's no written language, none of the things that we would find for the Bible. So why would God hide all the information for the Nephites if he didn't hide all the information about Israel and early Christianity? So as we studied through all of that, one of the things that really started bothering Gerald was when he saw that the Book of Mormon plagiarized so many passages out of the Bible. How could these people, before the time of Christ, have the same phrasing as the King James Bible had for Paul? And so we had to ponder that one a while and figured out, well, no, wait a minute. I don't think this is an ancient text. Someone's using their King James Bible to come up with portions of the Book of Mormon.
Yeah. So why don't we go ahead and maybe for those who are really wanting to learn and how to evangelize Mormons. I know my brother was interested in listening to the program. He told me, I think about a week ago, that he was coming back on a plane back to Kentucky, and he was sitting next to a guy who they started talking about the Lord. They started talking about the gospel, and then the guy pulled out a Book of Mormon, and he started to have this conversation with him. And so he was fascinated to learn. Maybe we can have you explain a little bit about where Mormonism came from, a little bit of the history and how it got started. Maybe talk about the visions that Joseph Smith's seen. I know there's more than one. Maybe people aren't aware of that.
When oh wow, how do I start all that? In New York, where the Smiths were at, there was a lot of revival activity, a lot of interest in going back to New Testament Christianity, and people were excited about maybe the return of Christ. So there was high religious interest. Well, Joseph Smith and his mother and sisters and brothers went to some revival meetings in the neighborhood. And the way Joseph Smith later told his story was that this revival meeting happened in 1820. And from that revival meeting, he went out into the woods to pray, and God told him not to join any of the churches. They were all wrong, and God was going to start a new work with him. Historically, the problem is there wasn't a revival in Palmyra, New York in 1820. The revival he talks about happened in about 1824, and it throws off the whole timeline of Mormonism. But he wanted to move the revival back to an earlier age when he was younger to make it sound more convincing that this young boy was out searching for God. When he tells the first vision story, he tells in different years, he tells different versions. So this becomes a problem in the historicity of the whole account. And Mormons will say to me, well, you could have several accounts of a car accident at the corner, and that wouldn't invalidate the accident. And I said, well, it would if one person gave several accounts. The problem isn't that you've got several people giving different accounts. The problem is you have one fellow telling different accounts. And it isn't just watching a car wreck. This is the guy who's supposed to be talking to God face to face. I think that would impress your mind pretty much, that you would remember the details. So we found historical problems with the first vision story. Then you get into his Book of Mormon is published, and it doesn't match any of the history that it claims to be. Then he came up with more scriptures and his revelations and his Doctrine and Covenants, which he rewrites through the years, and he changes his doctrines. Then he comes up with a temple ritual that hadn't been there at the beginning. Then he comes up with polygamy that hadn't been there at the beginning. And the years go by and Mormonism keeps changing. So when is it the restored church? It isn't today. It is not the same as it was in 1830 when he organized his church. And that's why you have all these splinter groups that believe different things, because each splinter group takes a different date of when they say the thing went off the rails. And so some groups say, oh, well, it was true for 3 years, or it went off the rails in 1835. No, it was 1840. Well, it went off the rails when Brigham Young took over. Well, it went into apostasy when they gave up polygamy. And the others would say it went into apostasy when they gave priesthood to blacks in 1978. So you have all these splinter groups with totally different beliefs because they take different slices of Mormonism and declare this particular year it was the true church. Now, later on, it wasn't. So it makes for a lot of confusion.
Yeah. Yeah, I was trying to listen through the Book of Mormon, and it did sound like, as I was listening to it, there was a lot of phrases that, as you mentioned earlier, that just caught my mind and sounded very KJV. And it sounded, it was kind of, for me, it was kind of like a boring read. It really wasn't a good storytelling. It was just like a boring read. But then when you look at the history of how Joseph Smith came about receiving these golden plates and then translating them. Maybe you can talk about that, because I'm confused with where some say it's a seer stone, some say he was sticking his head in a hat, or was behind a sheet. And so tell us about the golden plates and then how he translated these, or supposedly translated these.
Okay, when supposedly God gives him his call, he sends an angel, a guy named Moroni. And in Mormonism, angels are men who have either already lived on earth or will in the future live on earth. They're all the same species as men, gods, angels, devils are all the same species, just in different stages of development. So this angel is actually the last fellow that writes on this Book of Mormon plates the history of this ancient civilization. The last guy dies, becomes an angel, and is sent back to Joseph Smith to tell Joseph where he buried the record. And the record, wouldn't you know, was buried in a hill just up the street from Joseph Smith's house. And so he tells Joseph where to go to get the plates out of the ground. Now, when he takes the plates home, which no one sees, he always has them covered or in a box. No one literally sees the plates. They heft the box. They feel it through a cloth, but they don't really see what he's working with. I think he had made some sort of dummy model that wouldn't bear close scrutiny. Anyways, supposedly saved with the plates was 2 artifacts of crystals set in bowls, silver bowls, like huge eyeglasses. And this was supposed to be the ancient Urim and Thummim, which in the Old Testament, the priest had 2 stones in his vest that he could shake for, kind of like rolling dice, for a yes or no answer. So this was supposed to be this ancient artifact, the Urim and Thummim, with the plates. The problem is that the men that were in the room, well, even his own wife, and saw him dictate the Book of Mormon, say that he wasn't looking at the plates. The plates were covered over in a corner or hid out in the woods, and he's got his head looking in a hat with a stone in it. It's a little chocolate colored stone that's maybe 2.5 inches long or something. And he puts this stone in his hat, pulls the hat up over his face to exclude the light. And then it's like crystal ball gazing. And supposedly, as he looks at this stone, a text message, like a text message on your phone, comes across that stone, and he dictates that to his scribe. And the whole Book of Mormon was done this way. That was never the story told me as I grew up in Mormonism, but that's what all the people in the room describe. The church always has told people, no, it was these spectacles that were kept with the plates that God prepared, is what he used. In actual fact, Joseph and his dad were digging a well one year, and he found this stone and saved it because he thought it had magic powers. So you have the start of Mormonism wrapped up in this magic setting of crystal ball gazing, magic spells, incantations to try to bind the spirits that hide the treasures in the hillside. So the Book of Mormon then is this revealed text. It is not a translation of anything. It isn't like a Greek scholar doing a new version of the New Testament where you study for years to learn a language. This is, you just look at this stone and God gives you the translation. So it's a very mystical thing with the coming forth of the Book of Mormon.
And you've been talking about how he's been in kind of New York and there.
Yeah.
Can you tell our listeners, how does he get from New York all the way, or how does Mormonism start in New York and yet end up all the way in Utah?
Well, when Joseph starts his church in New York, they send out missionaries to try to get more converts. And some missionaries went through Ohio and converted a group of people that were kind of followers of Alexander Campbell and the Disciples of Christ movement that was just getting going. And one of the ministers in this movement was a man named Sidney Rigdon. He joined Mormonism right after they got the Book of Mormon out, or within the first 6 months. Sidney Rigdon brought his whole church congregation into Mormonism. And Joseph Smith then moved from New York down to this Kirtland community where he's got this ready-made congregation. A lot of people already set up to follow him. Missionaries also went down into the Kansas City, Missouri area and did missionary work there. So for several years, you have 2 settlements of Mormonism in Kirtland, Ohio, and down in Independence, Missouri. But the Mormons get run out of those places because of bad business deals. And being Northerners, the Southerners in Missouri thought the Mormons were abolitionists. And they voted as a block. That got all the neighbors upset when Mormons could dictate to their people, everyone vote the ticket we want. So you can see how, if suddenly 3,000 people moved into your neighborhood and they all voted as a block one way, it would get the community upset about controlling the elections. So anyways, the Mormons get run out of there, and eventually they have to settle in Nauvoo, Illinois, on the riverbank there. And then Joseph starts his secret polygamy and starts his own newspaper and has a growing church, starts his own army. Well, they run into all kind of problems there because of polygamy and their secret rituals and his political agendas. So they get run out of there and have to come to Utah. But while they're in Illinois, Joseph Smith is arrested for destroying an opposition newspaper. And while he's in jail, some citizens stormed the jail and shot him, thus giving the Mormons a martyr. Brigham Young, who was an apostle, stepped in the chaos to organize the church and get it back on track with the death of their leader. So then he became the man that led them west and stepped in and became the second president. So it wasn't that Joseph Smith had set up for Brigham to be his successor. It's just the way history played out for him to take the reins of the church. And Joseph set it up so that the senior apostle would become the president of the church. So they don't vote like the Catholics. They have a setup that dictates who the next prophet will be. It's always the man that served the longest as an apostle. So that stuck them with a system that eventually meant the oldest guy around was going to end up being your prophet because he would have served as an apostle the longest. And that's why today they have an apostle that's about 94 years old because he lived a long time and was able to finally come in at his old age into prophet.
Yeah, I always found that interesting. So I'm originally from Nebraska along the Platte River.
Yes.
I'm from Kearney, so there's a famous fort there, Fort Kearney, where they would stay. But just kind of understanding the history that the Mormon Trail, that westward, is on the north side, kind of through the town I lived in. And then the Oregon Trail was south, was on the south part. And they just would never meet. For some reason, they always kind of let the river be that divide.
Well, the Mormons knew that they weren't liked by other people, and they didn't want to have skirmishes all the time with the other people going west. So they deliberately stuck to the north side to have peace in their own community and be able to make their own way without having to bicker with all of the non-Mormons all the way.
Yeah, I'm in Ohio, and we're not that far. We're about an hour or so away from Kirtland. And I actually told my wife, I said it would be interesting to go and see because there's still that temple there, just to take the tour through it, just to kind of, again, have something to build off of in conversations with maybe Mormons that come by and say, hey, we've been to the temple there in Kirtland and seen that. Now, but I don't know if that actually belongs, and maybe you know or maybe you don't know if that belongs to the LDS or if that is one of the splinter groups.
It's owned by the splinter group, the reorganized LDS Church. It's now called the Community of Christ. And they would be very happy to show you through the building and explain it. The Community of Christ, it has moved away from a lot of Mormonism, and they aren't protective of their history. They'll admit to whatever problems you want to bring up about Joseph Smith, but they're from a more liberal perspective. They would claim to be Christians, but they take a much more liberal, almost Unitarian kind of approach to Christianity.
Yeah. Now, as you were saying there with Joseph Smith and then moving him out, kind of being forced out of Ohio into Missouri and then over to Illinois. A lot of that has to do with, you said some business deals, but Joseph Smith has a very shady past. He has some court records and things where he did some strange dealings. I also saw when I was listening to the history of Mormonism and learning through that he actually ran for president of the United States and then set himself up as, was it king or I think king of Nauvoo there?
Right. Joseph had a run-in with the law clear back before he even started Mormonism. In 1826, 4 years before he started his church, he was arrested for being a vagrant with no visible means of regular job support because he was using his stone and his hat to help the neighbors find buried treasure. And the police or the sheriff viewed this as gypsies going around with crystal balls telling fortunes. So he had a run-in with the court on that. But then through his years of running the Mormon church, he kept having run-ins with the laws over different financial dealings, not paying his bills, land disputes, all sorts of different problems, till they end up in Nauvoo. And then he has trouble with the law because of his secret polygamy. A man charges him, goes to the sheriff and charges him with illegal cohabitation with some girls, and also with absconding with their funds as their guardian. Had he lived, he would have had charges brought against him for counterfeiting. When the Mormons came west, Brigham Young was under indictment for counterfeitings, as was Apostle John Taylor and several other people. So the Mormons had their own ethic of God's given us the land, kind of like Israel going in to take Canaan. They felt that God gave them the land and they had the right to borrow against it, and the neighbors didn't see it that way. Mm-hmm. But then Joseph also was setting up this secret political organization to crown himself king, and he was running for president just before his death, because if he could get elected, they wouldn't have to take it over by
telling me that the tests, because they're not wanting to sell it. So I mean, so part of this isn't surprising.
Right, tricky stuff.
You mentioned polygamy. I want to talk about that a little bit. You being the great-great-granddaughter of Brigham Young, and then polygamy coming in. Now, when Joseph Smith was having this secret polygamy, this was not something, I believe, when he started this, that was being public to people. It was kind of hidden, secret, probably even trying to hid it from his wife. But some of these polygamous relationships, they seemed to be in marriage, but then the woman that he would marry, this polygamous marriage, would just stay where she is and whatever home she was living in, and it was kind of as if they weren't coming in all living together. It was kind of like a secret thing, right?
Right. Joseph Smith married, well, the count varies, but somewhere around 38 women in polygamy. And the Mormon church itself now admits that 12 to 14 of those women already were married with living husbands. Then we had about 9 or so that were teenage girls. There were a few that were widows, and then a few that were single. But it was all done secretly. It was against the law in Illinois to have another woman. It was seen as bigamy. You couldn't have any other than one wife. So he would have been subject to arrest if he had openly proclaimed he was taking all these women as wives. Not only was he keeping it from the public, but he was keeping it from his wife. He had already married, almost 24 women before Emma finally was convinced to accept polygamy. So he lied to her at the beginning and then only told her about a few of the women. She never knew how many he had married.
Yeah. And then that became part of the official teaching. Is that like after
he announced, when he went to these women privately, he would tell them this was a new revelation from God. This would guarantee the woman and her family eternal life. Your parents will be guaranteed eternal life and have godhood if you consent to marry me. And so he was very persuasive, and he would be able to convince people to do this, claiming it was a revelation from God. That revelation is still in the Doctrine and Covenants. It's section 132. Anyone with a Mormon Doctrine and Covenants can go read it themselves. In it, it's obvious that he had been keeping this all secret, because it says a man is supposed to ask his wife for permission, and if she won't give it, he's free from asking for it, and he can just go ahead and do it anyways. Well, it doesn't say it that plainly, but that's the gist of what it's saying. but she has to accept this or she'll be damned. So in this revelation that he gives to his wife on polygamy, he's threatening her through God that if she doesn't consent to this, she'll go to hell.
Yeah.
So it was it was very much presented as a doctrine, not just a practice.
Yeah. And sometimes I think that we as Christians who maybe didn't grow up in this or aren't in that religion, we look at this, and sometimes we can say with certain religious practices that are not Christian ones, how could people fall into that? How could people believe that? But again, going back to the time and as all those revivals was taking place, and Joseph Smith had to be a very charismatic, believable guy. He had to be for so many people to follow him. And then you put that burden, and if you think he's a man of God and he's putting that burden on these women that, hey, if you don't marry me, you could go to hell. But if you do marry me, your family's going to be saved, your whole family. And so the young girls may think, hey, this is a way that I can save my whole family here. Right.
And the Mormon Church in years past tried to cover up all of this. They're now confessing to more of these problem areas, but the average Mormon usually hasn't heard about it. But on the LDS website, they have what they call Gospel Topics Essays. In the Gospel Topics Essays is one on Nauvoo polygamy. And it's in that Nauvoo polygamy essay that they admit to all of these women that some were as young as 14, that 12 to 14 were married women. Then they concede all that. But they try to make it sound like some heavenly, beautiful concept. And then, of course, they want to say, well, it's not an issue today. They no longer practice it. But in actual fact, they still do, in that if a man is married to his first wife in the temple and she dies, he can marry the next woman in the temple. And by their belief, when they all get to heaven, he will be able to live polygamy. So their current prophet has outlived his first wife, and the wife he has now is his second wife. He married both of them in the temple. By Mormon beliefs, he will practice polygamy in heaven. So this is a current fear for a lot of Mormon women, that if I don't outlive my husband, I could find myself in the hereafter as one of 2 or 3 other wives. So a lot of women worry that they're going to be stuck with polygamy, whether they like it or not. It's not a dead doctrine. It's still there in their Doctrine and Covenants.
Yeah. So when you and your husband at the time was coming out of well, you was still in Mormonism, but as you said, you was just kind of leaning more to the Book of Mormon. What is some of what are some of the things that those who have grown up in Mormonism, especially being many generations of Mormonism, some of the things that they face from, especially being in Utah as well, very, Mormon population, dominated there. What are some of the challenges that they face in trying to come out of that with maybe many of their family members still in it?
Well, in a Mormon community, for one to leave Mormonism, you run the risk of your family disowning you, maybe not wanting you to come over and mingle with their kids anymore, afraid that you will contaminate the others with your apostate ideas. Some people get disinherited. Some people lose their jobs. Some people end up in divorce. It's a very hard thing to step out of this community. It isn't just like switching from the Baptist church to the Nazarene church. This is like switching from being Muslim to being Christian. The Mormons don't kill you for leaving, but they shun you and can make your life horrible for leaving and lead to divorce and loss of income, all sorts of things that way. So it's a very costly thing for someone to leave Mormonism. And when I talk to them here in the bookstore, I don't shield that. I mean, I fully admit that to them, that this could be very costly, but you have to determine what God means to you. Could you really stand before your maker? After Christ died on the cross for you, could you stand before your maker and say, yeah, well, I was worried I'd lose my job?
Yeah.
But it is a very hard, costly thing. We had troubles with our families when we left. not as bad as some people. I think the longer you're active in Mormonism, the older you get, the harder it is to leave, because your lifestyle, your job, your neighborhood, your family's in-laws, everybody is so tied up in Mormonism that the cost rises the older you get.
Yeah. Now you said when you started out, it wasn't a ministry, but you have the bookstore there now.
Yeah.
What was it that started you guys going? What was you trying to get out in print and like publications out to people to see some of the errors in Mormonism? What was it that got you guys started in, and what led to the bookstore now?
Well, we saw that there was some sort of problem with the first vision story about God and Jesus appearing to Joseph Smith. And we were pressing the church leadership for photocopies of the first accounts of Joseph's telling of the first vision, because we felt that the earliest accounts probably didn't read like the current one. So when we finally got copies of the earliest accounts, they contradicted each other. There were differences in the dates, on the reason he went out to pray, what was told him, who showed up. So we made photocopies of all these different accounts to hand out to all our family and friends. And of course, they all told us off. And so then we'd be on to the next topic. Oh, well, I'm a descendant of Brigham Young. Did you know what Brigham Young taught? He taught a lot of funny stuff they don't teach today. And people say, oh, no such thing. So we made photocopies of all these crazy sermons of Brigham Young, that Adam's our father and our God. Men has to live polygamy to have godhood. Adam's our father and our God. Blood atonement, there's certain sins you can commit that the blood of Christ won't cover. So we made photocopies of all these different sermons to show people. And then they'd say, oh, well, that's just one sermon. Okay, I'll get you 5 sermons on each of those topics. So then we start compiling stacks of photocopies and information on all these changes and doctrinal revisions that are being made. And so the stack keeps getting taller, and we end up with all this information. So then we make little pamphlets and give them out to everybody, and they all say we're crazy. So we made a bigger pamphlet with more references, and it just kept growing till we finally had to start getting better equipment to print it. We ordered a printing press, and it just came with an instruction manual. And once we figured out how to run that, we started printing our own books, which led to a bookstore, which led to a greater outreach of trying to share with people the research we're doing. And it just evolved into a ministry.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And now, so I would think that if people in your area are familiar with you, that would probably keep Mormons from coming into your store. But do they come in and you have these opportunities to engage them and share the good news with them?
Not very many active, true believing Mormons come in. In the early years, we had Mormons come in that wanted to argue all the time, but they gave up on us, I guess, because we don't get so many that come in to argue. The ones that come in now into the bookstore are having problems already. They know something's wrong. We had 2 people like that in the bookstore today. Some of your listeners may know Lynn Wilder, that did the book Unveiling Grace. She happened to be in town today, and a lady coming out of Mormonism contacted her, and she said, oh, well, meet me at Sandra's bookstore. So the 2 of them were in the bookstore talking when this man came in that he's thinking of coming out of Mormonism. So I took him in my office, and we sat and talked about the problems of Mormonism, and all going on at the same time. And in comes the mailman. I mean, it was a kind of crazy afternoon. But we have people come in regularly into the store that are struggling with Mormonism. They come in because they know I've been there, done that. I paid the price, and I understand the cost it would be to them. And I try to talk as a friend, one-to-one, that they know I'm not going to stand in condemnation because they are struggling to figure things out. Like the man I talked to, we talked a little bit about where he was at on his belief of God, and he's still struggling. When you lose Mormonism, the tendency is to throw everything out. He said, I always thought of it, Mormonism is either true or false. And if it's false, there's nothing else to believe in. Then his God was so tied to Mormonism that if Mormonism went, his God went. So we had quite a talk on why believe in God outside of Mormonism. And it was very difficult for something for him to separate out why believe in God outside of Mormonism. But we had a good talk, and he promised me he would come back later and talk to me again. He said, I've got to have time to process and think through all that we talked about.
Yeah.
So the main thing for people talking with their Mormon friends, first off, you got to understand that the Mormons have redefined all the Christian words. And you can't assume that when they say atonement, that they mean what you mean when you say atonement. When they say heaven, they don't mean what you mean when you say heaven. You have to understand their vocabulary. You need to show them love and kindness and acceptance. They're worried about being condemned and being belittled. They want a friend, someone that'll listen to them and come alongside, not someone that'll just condemn them right off and say, oh, well, if you don't immediately accept Jesus, you're going to hell. So we have to show them that kindness that would woo them into listening to the Christian message. We do see Mormons coming out and becoming Christians. There are more Christians in Utah than ever before. There's more former Mormon Christians in Utah than ever before, which is really helping to give a community to those that leave. But the important thing is that we've just got to show the kindness of Christ to give them time to process. When you've been trained in a whole different way of looking at the world your whole life, red was black, yellow was green, and you've got to rethink everything. Everything you thought about God was wrong. How do you process that? The day I accepted Christ, I sat there in my front room all alone, and I thought, okay, what does it mean to be a Christian and not a Mormon? What am I supposed to believe now that I didn't believe 10 minutes ago? That's a very hard thing to sort out. Mm-hmm. And the Christians have got to be ready to show the love, to stand alongside as they study and work their way through that.
Yeah.
You mentioned, getting community. How important is that for these ex-Mormons? Because I know from talking to my friends and just having people in the military that's moved to Ogden and, interact with Mormons, that community is a very big thing kind of in the Mormon faith. So how important is that, in that transition from becoming a Mormon to a Christian?
Right. I mean, think in terms of well, let's see, what would be a good example? An Italian neighborhood in Chicago, and you're suddenly going to tell everyone you don't want to be Italian in the neighborhood anymore. You're going to become a Zen Buddhist or something, and you don't fit anymore, and you don't have any friends. So for a Mormon, everything in their church is orchestrated and outlined. They have all kind of jobs they have to do in the church that throws them into each other's company all the time. And in a Mormon community, most all your neighbors are going to be Mormon, and they all know what you do, and they see whether you go to church. So it becomes obvious when you drop out and you aren't going. So that it's hard to hide when you decide you're not going to be Mormon anymore. The neighborhood's going to all know because it's such a closed group. And it makes a very lonely life, more so for the women than the men. Women make girlfriends and do stuff together a lot more than men do. So when a woman loses her membership in the Mormon church, she will also lose all her girlfriends. She doesn't fit with them anymore, and they will ostracize her because she's a threat to pull them away from their view of God. So it becomes a very lonely experience to come out. That's why it's so important to have former Mormon Christians here in the area that can offer friendship to these people when they come out.
Yeah. What are some of the suggestions that you would give to people? Because like, obviously you said when you started off, you was showing some of the problems with the visions, and then, you know, some of the teachings of, you know, Brigham Young's sermons, and you was showing people those things. What are some of the things you would say that when you're in a conversation with a Mormon, you probably shouldn't go down that route? You know?
Well, I think you can, in today's world, most people here in America, at least, may have a temple close by or somewhere in their area, or maybe they've visited the grounds of one of the Mormon temples. And I think that's something you can ask a Mormon, say, you know, like, oh, I was in Independence, Missouri, or I was in Salt Lake or whatever, and I saw your temple there, and I was curious why you built temples, because when I was reading my Bible the other day, it looked to me like temples were ended when Jesus died on the cross. So explain to me what the temple means to you. What does it do for you that would be so important to keep building these buildings? Because they're different from their meeting houses. So you can use whatever your contact is like that with a Mormon, use it as a means of opening a conversation to try to get them talking about, well, this gets back to works and grace. The Mormons say they believe in grace, but you got to do all these good works afterwards to get to the highest level of heaven. So then you want to find out, well, what are the good works I have to do? And this ties back to the temple. Because as a Christian, you can do all the good works helping little old ladies across the street, and it will never be enough for you to have eternal life that the Mormons hope to get. They have to have temple participation to get to the highest level of heaven. So you can use a visit to a temple ground, say you visited Nauvoo or whatever, as a means of asking them to explain to you how important is the temple, would I need it in order for me to get the best God has for me? And where do you see that in the New Testament? What is the grounds for that belief? Mm-hmm. I think we have to start where they're at in asking things about their view of their religion and ask them to explain something to us. Like they all have the Melchizedek priesthood. Oh, can you explain to me how you feel that you qualify for the Melchizedek priesthood? Because I was reading in the book of Hebrews, it looked to me like Jesus was the only high priest. So what's your view on high priest? What's the qualifications? Just find some way of introducing one of the concepts of Mormonism and start a conversation. You're trying to plant seed. You're trying to get them to think through something. Why do I believe this? If it's not in the New Testament, it's not a part of Christianity, why would I think God would ever introduce it later on?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you mentioned that when I was having conversations with my Mormon friend back in the military, he was quick to show me the parable of the bicycle and to trying to understand this idea of grace and work and redefinition with it. And being young and my faith at the time, I knew it was wrong, but I didn't know how to counter it at the time, because it was quite persuasive to think about it. You know, just do your best and God does the rest.
Okay, what I would use with a Mormon on grace and works, they have a book called Gospel Principles. It's a little manual they give to new converts, and they study it sometimes in Sunday school. Gospel Principles. It has a chapter called The Atonement. And in the chapter on the atonement, one of their apostles, Boyd Packer, gives a parable. And he specifically gives this parable to explain to us the way the atonement works. So in the parable, this man gets deeply in debt, and the creditor, who's obviously supposed to be God, calls in the loan. The guy can't pay off the money he owes, and he's threatened with prison. So the guy remembers he has a friend, which is obviously supposed to be the Jesus figure in the story. He remembers he has this friend, and he'll go ask him if he can help him. The friend comes along and says, okay, I'll go talk to your creditor and see if he'll accept me as the payment for your debt. So he gets that worked out with the creditor. Then he comes back to the guy and he says, okay, I got that worked out. I'll pay it to him. But if I pay off the debt, will you accept me as your creditor? I will set the terms. They will be easy. They will not be easy, but they'll be possible. And so what the story shows you is that the Mormon view of the atonement is Jesus refinanced your loan. Mm. He paid it off, and then you pay to him. So I tell Mormons, okay, if a Christian were telling this story and the Jesus figure would go to the Father and say, I'll pay it off, then he would have come to you and handed you a piece of paper that was stamped paid in full. Yeah. Now, you might go over and mow the guy's lawn because you're so thankful for what he did for you, but it doesn't make the loan more paid. Once you paid the loan and it's stamped paid in full, it doesn't matter what you do. It's not going to make it more paid. And I also use the illustration with the Mormons. It's like, say you needed a car to go to a university and you don't have any money. You can't afford to buy a car, but the only way you can get there is if you have a car. And so your older brother comes along and he says, in the Mormon view, I'll make the down payment on the car, but you have to make the rest of the payments. If Jesus is the one paying for the car, he doesn't just make a down payment, he pays for the whole car. And then whatever good you do for him is gratitude, not making your car more paid. So that's why I try to explain to them the difference between Christian grace and Mormon grace.
Yeah. Well, Sandra, we really do appreciate you coming on the program tonight and sharing with us about Mormonism. Could you let the listeners know where they can find more information about your ministry and maybe some resources that would be helpful for them if they wanted to learn more about Mormonism and be able to reach out to their Mormon friends?
Right. We have a website with tons of information and documents on Mormon history and doctrine. It's utlm.org. Stands for the name of our ministry, Utah Lighthouse Ministry. So it's utlm.org. And they can download all kind of free information, but we also have a lot of books for sale. They can listen to videos of me forever. But we're not the only ones in ministry. There's many other good ministries out there. MRM.org is another good one. IRR.org is another good ministry. There's a number of good, solid ministries that will help you in literature and ideas how to talk to your Mormon friends.
Yeah. Well, again, we want to thank you for coming on the program tonight.
Okay.
It was a blessing having you on. It was encouraging, again, the fascination with Mormon history. There's a lot there. It's American history for those here living in America that's watching that live in America. And so it's important to know these things because when the Mormons come knocking at your door, you're able to have these conversations. And it's always better to know more about your I don't want to say opponent in that sense, but those who maybe believe something different, for the sake of representing them well and not just thinking you know what they believe, but trying to represent them well, because we would do the same thing or want the same thing as Christians. We don't want people to say we believe something that we don't believe. So to maybe get an idea of what they believe, go to these ministries, get some more information, listen to some of Sandra's many videos that she says she's got out there. I listened to many of them, and you can learn more about the history to utilize it to reach out to your Mormon friends. And so thank you again for coming on the program tonight, Sandra. We appreciate it.
Thank you. Okay.
All right. That's been G220 Radio for tonight. Until next time.